Hello, hello. And we are so thrilled to have a conversation with Giselle. So, Giselle, I would love for you to introduce yourself to the viewing audience and also just try to talk a little bit about what you're inspired by right now in the work that you're doing.
So I'm Giselle Martin-Kniep, and thank you, Allison and Benna, for inviting me to be part of this interview and highlight some of the work I do that may connect to some of the work you do. So I am the president and founder of Learner-Centered Initiatives. It's a small consulting firm. We provide support and services and programs and resources for schools. Work primarily in public schools in the United States and in other kinds of schools abroad. Our work centers is really in three areas, most of it in curriculum instruction and assessment or in leadership development and evaluation. Those are the two major areas. And we're now growing our work around adult learning facilitation. I've been doing this work for about 26 years, 27, I think. And,
we know what really happened, Giselle. You started when you were 10. So, 26
yes.
years, not a problem.
26 years is nothing.
Nothing.
I've always been excited by the question of what is worth assessing. And I mean, in general, it's a question that still drives me. I believe assessment is an incredible lever. But like you all know, we often assess what's easy to measure rather than what's worth measuring. That work has grown and iterated in lots of different ways, including a very strong emphasis on authentic assessment and performance-based assessment and process assessment. And increasingly, over the last few years, I've been very interested in figuring out how to attend and assess intangible outcomes like creativity, problem solving, dissonance making, ambiguity, tolerance, empathy, and so on. For the past 2 years, one of the areas that has triggered a lot of my interest is related to that, and it has to do with civic discourse, civic participation, and democratic discourse, because it incorporates several of those dispositions: listening to understand, managing ambiguity, tolerating understanding or at least respecting multiple perspectives, pursuing complex issues that are not easy to resolve. And so I would say that one of my deep passions now centers around not only defining civic engagement, but figuring out what it looks like, what it could look like in schools, and then what of it should be or could be assessed.
So one of the things that really intrigued me, and I have the privilege of talking with you over dinner and at different times about the fabulous work that you do. And one of the things that appealed to me so much about what you're doing, among many things, is how closely tied it is to the way we think about the 4 attributes for personalizing learning. And so, of course, you and we overlap enormously in terms of our interests and our interests in dispositions. We use the habits of mind directly connected to the dispositions that you're talking about. And so what I wanted to do was just frame it for a moment from the way I saw it in relationship to our work. Mm-hmm. So the 4 attributes that we talk about is not in any particular order, but one of the things that I love so much about what you're doing here is that you're inviting voice, and you're inviting the voice of the community, the voice of the students, the voice of the teachers, the administrators. So this whole idea of thinking about voice as a way of building a culture, and really a culture of common understandings. And then in addition to that, the idea of co-creation. So yesterday, when Allison and I were planning for this call, we had an interesting conversation because we were saying, gee, we always use the context of curriculum when we say co-creation, thinking it's a design moment. Mm-hmm. But what I think is so intriguing about what you're doing, and should really expand our thinking, is it's the co-creation of ideas that you're doing.
The framing problem.
And the framing. And that really is very exciting because it expands our understanding of what we mean by co-creation. And then the idea of social construction, where I was saying that what, again, I so admire is that although everyone comes with an opinion, you inform that opinion with either text that they need to read, a close reading of text in a meeting, or some way to say that the construction of meaning is really larger than just our exchange with one another, but we also are informed by something that is either external or we have an expert that works with us.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, self-discovery, which is, I can only imagine, but I know from some of the responses that you've gotten from people, what they learn about themselves as much as what they learn about the issues at stake. So to me, the whole idea that you're doing is so much a part of building a culture in which it's possible for civic discourse to take place meaningfully. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing closer to personalizing learning than to think of that kind of culture as a way to really relate, to get to know one another, and to know a little bit more about our opinions, our aspirations, our dreams.
Yeah, I love that frame.
So speak on.
So I love the frame, and I think, attempt to characterize or at least describe some of the work that you're alluding to, and then connect it to those four components as I see them. So to just concretize this, civic engagement and democratic discourse has been actually a mandate of public schools since the beginning of public schools in the United States.
That's right.
And yet, over the course of years, and especially with the advent of accountability mandates and standards and expectations, it has become relegated and I would say not only narrowed, but delegated to a very small spectrum of what civic engagement and democratic discourse actually entails. So some people equate civic engagement simply with voting, and some people characterize schools or the role of schools in terms of informing that, in terms of civics education. And civics education has become compartmentalized into a small aspect, a very narrow band of the curriculum. And so one of the goals of the work that I'm doing now, strategic planning and action research work with schools and school districts, entails, first of all, developing a shared definition of civic engagement. You know, what actually is civic engagement? What does it entail? And what does democratic discourse actually means? And where does it live? Where should it live? And where does it live? So in terms of even understanding what that means, knowing that systems are very big and that we all see a system only from our perspective, it is critical to bring to the table all the key stakeholders of that reality. So this action research teams include teachers, administrators, board members, parents, community members, none of them in a tokenized way, but each as a responsible and active member of this thinking community that lends his or her perspective, background, and interest to the conversation of what is and should be civic engagement. So we start off by defining it. And in order to define it and co-create it, we need a couple of we need to deepen their knowledge base, and then we also deepen their understanding of their current reality. So to deepen their knowledge base, we have several mentor texts. One of my goals actually is for them to experience democratic discourse and civic engagement as they're learning. So they're not learning about Socratic seminars, they're not learning about U-shaped debates, they're not learning about deliberations, they're doing them. And so every step of the way, whether it's defining civic engagement, deciding what artifacts to look for in their schools, analyzing the data, summarizing the data, deliberating on the meaning of that data, exploring reconciling that data around what civic engagement should be from different authoritative sources, debating the limits, of what schools can and should do. All of that is co-created and is informed internally by their own engaging in multiple discussions and deliberations, using authoritative sources that depict multiple perspectives and gathering data from their schools. So we have like these 3 points of entry.
So as you're describing it, Giselle, one of the things that I picked up on right in the beginning of the conversation was being able to handle ambiguity. And one of the beautiful things as you're describing it is, by definition, actually articulating a definition of civic engagement and democratic discourse is something that we all potentially know as an individual. But when you're putting out different definitions or explanations in the light of day, you immediately run into areas of dissonance, areas where people believe that it's overstepping one's bounds,
right,
or people believe that this is something that can be relegated to a character ed program or advisory or a civics education course, which for the most part, as I see in curriculum work around the country, is more driven by content knowledge than by this level of civic engagement that you're describing. So I find that to be incredibly fascinating, not just through the lens of the mentor text, but they are living the work as they're doing the work. But it's really centered in that notion of ambiguity and dissonance that you said initially.
You're absolutely right. I mean, a critical aspect of civic engagement is to think critically so that you can embrace the complexity of the issues that you're trying to understand. You have to think critically. You have to negotiate ambiguity. You have to reconcile multiple perspectives. You have to define the limitations of those perspectives. And you have to suspend disbelief as some of those perspectives impinge upon your own values or belief systems. And this is hard work. So it requires a willingness, first of all, to accept and embrace ambiguity. It requires a willingness to listen to understand as opposed to listen to engage. It requires a willingness to deliberate and discuss without forcing the need for a quick resolution. And then it also requires sort of that last step, which is the willingness to take action. And that goes to, I think, one of your, you talk about the social construction and you also talk about the self-discovery. I think there's a social construction, there's also a self and an other discovery. As I'm working with you or with others, I discover things about me, but I also discover things about you and things about us that we can work together towards or not. I mean, there's all that decision to be made.
So in a sense, as much as you find that there's dissonance and ambiguity, there's also the potential that you find commonalities, and that those commonalities are often surprising.
Correct.
Because you think that you're so opposite of one another, and suddenly you're finding that there's some common ground, and that common ground often defines the kinds of actions that you might take.
Right. And I think a missing piece in this, one of the missing ingredients we haven't talked about is, in order to find those common aspects, when we talk about democratic discourse, we're not talking about any discourse. We're talking about democratic discourse that is by itself anchored in democratic values and principles. So that also involves learning what those are and grappling with what it means, to be equitable or fair or tolerant. I mean, any one of those any one of those words has strong connotations that need to be unpacked,
So Giselle, there are a couple of things that are rolling through my mind. The first is there has been this huge wave back a couple of years around the idea of courageous conversations. And I think the notion of having communities be able to engage in courageous conversations, how does that typically line up with the work that you're doing now? So, yeah.
Well, so there's a lot of aspects to courageous conversations, but let's start with the notion that in the work that we're doing, there's a deliberate starting point, which is let's define what this stuff is, civic engagement and democratic discourse, and let's involve all the key stakeholders in the process. So once you have a shared definition of what that is, and once you have a united front among representative constituencies who are willing to ask questions, share that definition, collect artifacts, engage others in conversations, I think you're already creating a context. You're feeding into a context and a culture where it will be the likelihood of a conversation that is difficult to happen in the future to be had is greater than if this had been a mandate from central office that, no, we are all going to engage in democratic discourse, or we're going to teach civic engagement in this way. So I think the first step in terms of creating the opportunities for courageous conversations is to create a safe culture and a context that says it's okay to have conversations about these things. It's okay for us to deliberate and discuss what opportunities for civic engagement third graders should get or eighth graders should get, and what are the parameters and the boundaries for those opportunities. Once we know that it's okay to do that, I'm so sorry, this is going to be a problem. That's probably a marketing call.
That happens.
It's probably from the Democratic Party.
It's probably from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, saying, wait a minute, Giselle, we're not going there.
But it happens again, I'll just very quickly hang up. So first it's creating the context, then it's feeding the skill set. You know,
yeah.
One of the things that I learned in the first year piloting this work and trying to do it with another group of districts is one of the things that there was great consensus among the teams was, one, that civic engagement really mattered. Two, that teachers really needed the skills and strategies for engaging students and themselves in civic engagement, because a corollary of we need civic engagement is it's not just for the students. I mean, adults themselves have to find their own avenues for civic engagement or rekindle them. And so the skill set of teaching about controversial issues or facilitating a deliberation or knowing the difference between a debate and a discussion or engaging in different types of text-based discussions or helping students adopt counter perspectives, that's a skill set that not all teachers have. And that is, I think it is also part of the ammunition or the ingredients for courageous conversations.
So, excuse me, I find it so interesting because as outcomes and profiles of graduates, all we see is we want them to be critical thinkers, we want them to be, I don't think that we ever really dig more deeply and ask the question, to be a critical thinker takes courage.
Correct.
So I think what you're bringing to the light is the idea that it's not a simple matter. And one of the things that I thought was interesting out of the lessons I think you learned in the last year were 2 tools that you designed that were really tools to kind of facilitate those kinds of conversations on behalf of both teachers and on behalf of, in other words, for adult learning, for student learning, and for any co-creative way of looking together at all these things, that we all have to really have the dispositions. And to me, I feel the key dispositions are listening with understanding and empathy, and secondly, questioning and allowing yourself to pose problems rather than assuming that the resolution to something comes easily. Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about those two tools? Because I think they're would be wonderful to be able to share with others.
Sure. So I think one of the areas that has been important for us to unpack is what does effective listening entail? What are the behavioral manifestations of the good listener? And so one of the tools really unpacks those behavioral manifestations. What does listening to understand actually mean? There are other tools. One of them is the attributes of rigor or critical thinking. And in that context, it's really what are the qualities of a thinker and what are the attributes of critical thinking that support rigor and depth of understanding. There are other tools in the LCI website under resources. There's a number of different tools that relate to feedback, to critical thinking, to discourse, and to listening. And each of these is really designed to provide either a lens for teachers or a lens for students to see and peer review, peer assess, or self-assess their own dispositional attributes around that. I wanted to say one more thing in response to connecting to what you said and what Allison was bringing up about courageous conversations that is really important. Courage. One of the other things I learned very clearly last year, and it's been echoed by the work this year, is that there's a need for schools to define the boundaries of what's acceptable from a policy standpoint, meaning, and this is contextual. You know, we could talk about certain religious issues in one school and in others it would be very difficult to do so. Or we could talk about various political or policy related issues much easier in some contexts than others. Teachers, I think, in order for them to be better able to manage courageous conversations, what they're looking for is some clear policy from their boards or from their administration about who's got their back.
Yeah.
And so courage, individual courage of teachers, you can cultivate that all you want. But if you want to create a culture, a courageous culture is transparent about what it stands for. And what it's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And I think that in that context for civic engagement, I think it's very important to not be working individually with teachers, but not assume that this is an individual problem or a problem of individual capacity. It's really at the heart of what schools should be asking themselves. You know, what do we want our students to be able to think critically about, and in what ways? And how will we protect our children? How will we enable them to actually have the capacity to deliberate in ways that they won't be able to deliberate when they leave the school? You know, in a polarized environment.
So based on the insight that you just shared and what Benna was describing a few minutes ago, I think an interesting disposition is the idea of thinking interdependently in this mix.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think as we're winding down the conversation, sort of the last question that I have is the idea of when is the goal to actually engage in a rich, robust, and potentially uncomfortable conversation, not only to grow the thinking, but also to grow the empathy and the understanding of the diverse viewpoints of the group. But when is it actually a time for action? When does that shift happen? When it's no longer good enough to just engage in these rich, important conversations? What have you seen?
So I want to, first of all, underscore the huge value of those dispositions, those habits of mind. In fact, some of the work we do with these groups involves having them reconcile their indicators of civic engagement with the habits of mind, and really think about the role of those habits in supporting those indicators. So I think I'm glad you brought that up, because it's not just thinking interdependently. There's a role for each and every one of those habits to play itself out. I think the issue of when is it enough, when is it not sufficient to take action, is a significant question, and a question that districts have to really come to terms with. In the group, in both of the groups that I've been working with, that is both of the collection of groups and district teams, it's very clear that the committees have not rested on the let's just get smarter, and that taking action has become an important component that they don't want to let go of. But the taking action is the most political of those dimensions.
Right.
And that is where the boundaries between participation and advocacy, or education and advocacy, begin to get blurry. So when is it okay for a student or for a group of students to pursue or address an issue in their community, as in they're addressing it themselves, as opposed to advocating for its resolution, as opposed to actually going out into the streets, or all of those. That is one of the ways in which, that is one of the reasons for having these multiple constituencies represented, because they can push each other to the ultimate limits of where that community can go. In other words, you have the students there, and the first thing they say is, we need to take action. They just cut to the chase.
Right.
Define civic engagement in 3 minutes, and they're ready to go. And then you've got on the other side all the other groups, and I'm not going to name any of the groups, but it's in finding the common ground around where and to what extent we need to take action, that you end up with policies and practices that have integrity. I personally don't think you can be civically engaged without taking action. To me,
I think
the question is, what action?
Yeah, I think that it goes back to the boundaries question that you raised earlier, which is, I always think about it as we're there to teach, not preach.
Correct.
And as soon as you cross that line of advocacy, you may be moving toward preach.
Correct.
And so the question is really one of saying, collectively, what is appropriate and what are the boundaries for, let's say, schools to support.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, having made students aware of, critically thinking about issues, there's nothing that says that they can't take action or that the community can't. So there's a distinction between take action being more like the League of Women Voters.
Correct.
Take action means, where do we have these dialogues continuing? How do we make sure we bring more people into it as one form,
mm-hmm.
as opposed to let's go out in the streets and strike, which is another form.
Correct.
And I think that, and then of course the Parkland students who, from the gun, the situation where they went and said, we're no longer going to tolerate the policy, the legislation that we have in the state of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
But that was not done. It was done as a result of something that happened in the school, but the school was not necessarily the activator. It was the students who activated themselves.
Right.
So all those are highly important and nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's really a matter of, as you say, having everybody at the table for thinking about that. But it's not a simple matter. And I think having a teacher's back on this becomes critically important.
Yes.
So that means that probably we can build the culture for the dialogue and for the discussion, but I'm not sure we can build the culture for action unless we also have the kinds of policies that really support the kinds of actions that might grow out of it.
Right. That's why having a board representation is essential, because this has policy implications.
Right. And I remember,
and I think that, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I remember that in Pennsylvania, I was very much a part of a group that really got into this. And it was around the issue of fracking, which is quite central to this particular area in Pennsylvania. And what was interesting was also that there were students who were coming from homes who disagreed about the conclusions that they were coming to.
Mhm.
So it isn't just a matter of, you know, what kind of action, but also the implications of you and your community outside of the school
Right.
and your family. So it just has always struck me as being enormously kind of delicate and yet courageous and important.
Mhm. I agree.
And I was going to just say that this is so important that a system is engaged in this, because while we can have very brave hearts and sort of lead the charge, I think on some level it's very difficult for kids to be able to navigate what's safe in one context of the school and how it translates or doesn't translate in other classrooms that are led by different teachers or with administrators as well.
Right.
And one of the things that Ben and I continue to talk about is that it's unfair to go after this level of civic engagement and democratic discourse as an expectation of the classroom teacher if it's not present up and down the system. So if I feel like my voice is not heard as a staff member, then that part needs to continue to shift and grow too.
Correct. It is civic engagement is for all. You know, I can't support it for children and teach it if I myself am not living it.
And
Right.
dispositions are for all as well.
These are for all as well.
So
That's
with
right.
that in mind, let's what I think we can bring this to a close, although we will probably ask you to open it up again and keep us informed because your practice is so exciting. And I think that what we want to do is make sure that we link people to your work. So
Yes.
when we do this, I think we'll put a link to the LCI and the tools.
Right. What I could do is I can extract the tools that are most connected to the conversation we just had, and I can just send you a link to those.
Great.
You can send them to the link of all the resources, but at least you will have each of the tools that relate directly to the work we've been discussing.
And then
Absolutely.
also, I think your book on Communities for Learning would be really valuable as well.
Yep. And we'll put a link on that at the bottom of this interview as well. So Giselle, it's been such a joy to spend about a half an hour or so with you and continuing to open our thinking about the significance of creating this as a community-wide conversation. So, and we're looking forward to continuing to have more of these conversations like this.
Well,
So thank you.
Thank you. I love your work as well. And I think it is such a great opportunity to explore the intersection between our ideas.